The town of Moscow, Idaho, had gone to sleep. For thousands of students, it had been another ordinary Saturday night. Friends met for drinks, house parties spilled into the early hours, takeaways were collected, phones buzzed with messages promising to catch up tomorrow. Inside a rented house on King Road, 4 university students returned home believing the weekend was almost over. None of them knew they were living the final hours of their lives. Before the sun rose, someone entered the house. When daylight came, one of America's safest college towns would become the centre of one of the largest murder investigations in modern history. 4 young students had been stabbed to death. There were no signs of forced entry, no murder weapon, no immediate suspect, no obvious motive. As news spread across the country, fear took hold. Parents drove through the night to bring their children home. Students locked doors they had never thought to lock before. Police faced mounting pressure. And with every passing day that no arrest was made, speculation filled the silence. Was this a targeted attack? Had the killer left town? Or was the person responsible still living among them, attending lectures, shopping in the same stores, and passing unnoticed through everyday life? It would take more than 6 weeks, thousands of investigative hours, and one of the most painstaking forensic investigations in recent memory, before detectives finally uncovered the truth. This is the story of the Idaho murders, a case that shattered 4 families, captured the world's attention, and proved that sometimes the most ordinary places can become the scenes of the most unimaginable crimes. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm Matt, and I'm your host. Before we get into today's episode, if you enjoy the time and research that goes into these documentaries, and you'd like to help support the show, you can do so through my Buy Me a Coffee page. Every contribution helps me continue producing independent, long-form true crime content, and you'll find the link in the episode description. You can also find the show across social media at @WhatTheyHidePod. If you have a case you'd like me to investigate, or you'd simply like to get in touch, you can email me at whattheyhidepod@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate if you could follow the show, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who loves true crime. It genuinely helps more people discover the show. Today's episode contains discussion of multiple murders and violence. While nothing is included for shock value, some listeners may find aspects of this case distressing. Listener discretion is advised. Alright, let's crack on with the show. When people think of the Idaho murders, they often think of the headlines, the house, the investigation, the suspect, the DNA, the trial. But before any of that, there were 4 young people with plans, ambitions, and futures stretching out ahead of them. This chapter isn't about how they died, it's about how they lived. Because before they became victims in one of the most talked about murder cases in recent history, they were simply friends. Like so many university students across America, our story begins in Moscow, Idaho. Despite its name, Moscow has nothing to do with Russia. It's a small university town tucked away in the rolling countryside of the American Northwest, close to the border with Washington state. For decades, it had earned a reputation as one of the safest places in Idaho. Around 25,000 people called it home, and much of the town revolved around one institution, the University of Idaho. Every autumn, thousands of students arrived looking for independence. For many, it was their first taste of adulthood. Shared houses, late-night food runs, new friendships, weekend parties, the sort of memories that stay with people for the rest of their lives. Among those students was 21-year-old Kaylee Gonsalves. Friends described Kaylee as energetic, fiercely loyal and full of life. She had a quick sense of humour and the kind of personality that naturally drew people together. She had recently accepted a graduate job with a technology company in Texas and was preparing to begin an exciting new chapter after university. That weekend was meant to be one of her last visits to Moscow before moving away. She'd returned to spend time with the friends she'd made during her years at university. One of those friends was Madison Mogan. Known to almost everyone as Maddie, she and Kaylee shared a friendship that stretched back years. They became inseparable, describing each other as sisters rather than simply friends. Photographs of the pair show two young women who seemed genuinely happy in each other's company, laughing, travelling, celebrating birthdays, enjoying the sort of ordinary moments most of us barely think twice about. Xana Knodel was 20 years old. Friends remembered her as kind, outgoing and fiercely protective of those she cared about. She had a bright personality and an infectious smile that appeared in almost every photograph taken of her. She was dating Ethan Shapin. Ethan was also 20. He'd grown up alongside his brother and sister as one of a set of triplets, something that made the family especially close. Athletic, warm and easygoing, Ethan was known for making people laugh. Those who knew him often spoke about his kindness before anything else. Unlike the three young women who lived at the King Road house, Ethan was staying over that Saturday night after spending the evening with Xana. 4 ordinary young people, 4 families who had every reason to believe the future was full of graduations, careers, weddings and children. None of them could possibly have imagined that this ordinary November weekend would become one of the most infamous in modern American history. As Saturday, the 12th of November 2022, drew to a close, the town settled into its familiar weekend rhythm. Bars filled with students, house parties carried on late into the night, friends made plans for breakfast the next morning. Somewhere among those crowds, someone else was making plans that would end 4 lives before the sun rose. And that is where our timeline begins. Saturday, the 12th of November 2022. For most people in Moscow, Idaho, it was an ordinary autumn weekend. The air was cold, the streets were busy, and as darkness fell, the familiar rhythm of university life took over once again. Students gathered in bars, house parties filled with music and conversation. Others stayed in, catching up on coursework or spending the quiet evenings with friends. No one knew that within a matter of hours, one of the most infamous murder investigations in modern American history would begin. Earlier that day, Kaylee Gonsalves had returned to Moscow to spend time with friends. She was excited to show Maddie her new Range Rover, a recent purchase that marked the beginning of the next chapter in her life. With graduation approaching and a job already lined up in Texas, there was a feeling that this weekend was something of a farewell before life pulled everyone in different directions. Kaylee and Maddie did what close friends often do. They spent time together, they laughed, they took photographs. One of those photographs, later shared by Kaylee's family, would become one of the defining images of the case. It showed the 6 young housemates together, smiling into the camera. Looking at it now, it's impossible not to wonder what was going through their minds. Not one of them knew it would be the last photograph taken of 4 of the people standing there. Elsewhere that evening, Xana Knodel and Ethan Shapin attended a party at Ethan's fraternity house. Friends later described the atmosphere as relaxed and typical of a university weekend. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested that either of them felt threatened or believed they were in danger. Meanwhile, Kaylee and Maddie spent the evening in downtown Moscow. Like countless students before them, They visited local bars, enjoyed themselves, and eventually stopped to buy food from a late-night food truck before heading home. The food truck was equipped with a live stream camera, something that would later provide investigators and the public with one of the final confirmed glimpses of the two friends alive. The footage has since been viewed millions of times, not because it shows anything sinister, but because it shows two friends behaving exactly as you would expect after a night out. They're chatting, waiting for food, sharing a few laughs, completely unaware that history is quietly moving towards them. Just after 1:40 a.m, Kaylee and Maddie left the food truck in a private ride arranged for a designated driver service and arrived back at the King Road house a short time later. Around the same time, Xana and Ethan also returned to the house after leaving the fraternity party. By the early hours of Sunday morning, the occupants of 1122 King Road appeared to be settling in for the night. Lights went off, doors closed, phones were plugged in to charge. To anyone passing outside, it would have looked like every other student house in Moscow. Warm, lived in, peaceful. But investigators would later piece together evidence suggesting that while the house was growing quieter, someone else was still moving. Someone whose journey that night would become one of the most closely examined timelines in modern criminal history. The story begins just after 2:30 in the morning, and that's where we'll pick up in the next chapter. By 2:30 on Sunday morning, Moscow had begun to fall quiet. The streets that had been filled with students only an hour earlier were now largely empty. Most lights across the town had gone out. For those inside the King Road house, the evening appeared to be over, or so they believed. Investigators would later spend months reconstructing these next few hours, not through eyewitness accounts, but through digital footprints, security cameras, mobile phone records, vehicle movements, and tiny fragments of evidence that, on their own, meant very little. Together, they would tell an extraordinary story. At around 2:42 a.m, surveillance cameras captured a white Hyundai Elantra travelling through Pullman, Washington. At the time, it was simply another car driving through the darkness. No one gave it a second thought. Over the following months, detectives would trace that vehicle's movements with painstaking detail, using footage from homes, businesses, and university cameras spread across two neighbouring towns. The route suggested a journey from Pullman towards Moscow, just a few miles, less than a 20-minute drive, the kind of trip thousands of people make every day. Meanwhile, life inside the King Road house continued as normal. The two surviving roommates had returned home earlier and were in their bedrooms. Kaylee and Maddie had made several attempts to call Kaylee's former boyfriend, Jack Ducour. The calls went unanswered. Investigators later examined those calls carefully. Were they significant? Had something happened? Or were they simply the sort of late-night calls made after an evening out? At the time, nobody knew. As news of the murders spread, those unanswered calls became the focus of enormous public speculation. Online forums filled with theories. Some people became convinced the ex-boyfriend must be somehow involved. Others claimed the repeated calls pointed to an argument, but detectives weren't interested in assumptions. They were interested in evidence. They interviewed Jack, examined his movements, reviewed the available information. As the investigation progressed, police publicly stated that they did not believe he was involved. It was an early reminder that public suspicion and police evidence are rarely the same thing. Back outside, the white Hyundai continued moving through the darkness. Investigators would later allege that the vehicle made multiple passes near the King Road neighbourhood before finally approaching the area of the house. Why? That question would become one of the biggest mysteries in the entire case. Was the driver looking for someone, trying to decide whether to go through with something, or simply driving around the neighbourhood? The evidence could show where the vehicle travelled. It could not tell investigators what was going through the driver's mind. Inside the house, the atmosphere remained calm. Phones were charging, bedrooms were quiet. The ordinary sounds of a student house settling for the night slowly disappeared. For everyone inside, it seemed the weekend had come to an end. No one knew that, in just a matter of minutes, someone was about to walk towards the house. Someone carrying a knife. Someone whose identity would remain unknown for weeks. The silence that surrounded King Road that morning would soon be broken forever. There are moments in every investigation where detectives can reconstruct almost every movement, and moments where they can only piece together fragments. The events that unfolded inside 1122 King Road during the early hours of 13th of November 2022 are a combination of both. Some details are known, others may never be. What follows is based on the evidence presented by investigators and the facts established through the case. Just before 4 o'clock that morning, surveillance cameras in the neighbourhood captured the white Hyundai Elantra once again. According to investigators, the vehicle approached the King Road area after making several earlier passes. This time, it didn't keep driving. Somewhere nearby, it came to a stop. Exactly what happened over the next few minutes remains known only to one person. Investigators believe the killer entered the house through a sliding glass door at the rear of the property. Unlike the front entrance, it offered a route that was hidden from the road. Inside, the house was quiet. Most of the occupants were asleep. One of the surviving roommates would later tell investigators that she had been woken by what sounded like someone playing with a dog upstairs. It wasn't enough to immediately cause alarm. Student houses are rarely silent. People come home at different times. Friends visit. Doors open and close. Odd noises in the early hours aren't unusual. A short time later, she thought she heard a voice saying something like, "There's someone here." Whether those words were spoken by one of the victims or by someone else inside the house has never been established publicly. Moments later, another sound, this time crying. Then, according to investigators, a male voice calmly said, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Those words have echoed throughout the case ever since. Were they intended to reassure, to deceive, to control? Only the killer knows. Within minutes, 4 young lives have been taken. Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Knodel, and Ethan Chapin. The attack happened with extraordinary speed. Investigators later estimated that the entire sequence of events lasted only minutes. Then, silence returned. One of the surviving roommates later opened her bedroom door once more. Standing in the hallway, she saw a figure, dressed in black clothing, walking towards the sliding glass door. She described seeing bushy eyebrows above a mask covering the person's nose and mouth. The figure walked past her and disappeared into the darkness. She locked her bedroom door. Like so many aspects of this case, people have questioned what happened next. Why didn't anyone immediately realise the scale of what had occurred? It's a question that has been asked countless times. But investigators and trauma specialists have pointed out that people can react to terrifying situations in unexpected ways. Confusion, shock and fear can affect perception and decision making in ways that are difficult to predict from the outside. By approximately 4:20 a.m, investigators alleged that the white Hyundai Elantra was captured leaving the area at speed. Within minutes, it was gone. Behind it, the town remained asleep. No emergency sirens, no police cars, no neighbours rushing into the street. For hours, nobody knew what had happened inside that house. The person responsible had vanished into the darkness. The victims had not yet been found. And one of the biggest homicide investigations in modern American history hadn't even begun. Dawn broke over Moscow, Idaho, like any other Sunday morning. The streets slowly came back to life. Coffee shops opened their doors. Church bells rang across the town. Students began waking after another Saturday night out. For most people, it was just another day. At 1122 King Road, time had stood still. Hours passed. The house remained eerily quiet. Nobody outside knew that 4 young people were lying dead inside. Sometime later that morning, friends began arriving at the property. At first, nothing seemed obviously wrong. Student houses are unpredictable places. People sleep in. Bedroom doors stay shut. Hangovers make for slow mornings. But it quickly became clear that something wasn't right. Attempts were made to contact the occupants. Calls went unanswered. Bedroom doors remained closed. Confusion began to turn into concern. Shortly before midday, someone inside the house called 911 using one of the surviving roommates' mobile phones. The call itself has never been released in full to the public. Early reports created enormous confusion, with references to an unconscious person, leading many people to wonder whether dispatchers had misunderstood what had happened. In reality, emergency operators can only work with the information being given to them in those first frantic moments. Within minutes, police officers and paramedics were racing towards King Road. Nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what they were about to find. When officers entered the house, they were met with a scene of extraordinary violence. 4 university students had been killed. The house, only hours earlier filled with laughter and conversation, had become a homicide scene. News spread quickly through the small university town. Blue flashing lights filled King Road. Crime scene tapes surrounded the property. Neighbours stood in silence, trying to understand what had happened. As word reached the University of Idaho campus, disbelief quickly turned to fear. Students who had never thought twice about leaving their doors unlocked suddenly questioned whether they were safe. Parents watched the news in horror. Many immediately got into their cars and drove to Moscow to bring their children home. The shock reached far beyond Idaho. National news networks interrupted regular programming. Helicopters circled above the quiet residential neighbourhood. Television crews lined the streets. Questions came thick and fast. Who could have done this? Why these 4 students? Was this a targeted attack? Or was there a killer still walking free? For investigators, however, there was no time to speculate. They had a house to secure, witnesses to identify, evidence to preserve. Thousands of hours of work lay ahead. At that moment, they didn't know they were standing at the beginning of an investigation that would stretch across state lines, involve the FBI, generate tens of thousands of public tips, and become one of the most closely scrutinised murder inquiries in recent history. Their first task was far simpler: find out who had done this, and they had almost nothing to go on. By the afternoon of 13th of November 2022, the quiet streets of Moscow had been transformed. Police vehicles lined King Road. Investigators moved carefully in and out of the house. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the road. Residents gathered behind police cordons, hoping for answers. But the people behind those cordons had no more idea what had happened than anyone else. Inside the house, investigators began the painstaking task of documenting every room, every photograph, every footprint, every fingerprint, every possible clue. A homicide scene isn't processed in hours. It takes days, sometimes weeks. Nothing can be rushed. Every piece of evidence has to be preserved because one tiny mistake can change the course of an entire investigation. As detectives worked inside the house, officers began the equally difficult task of building a timeline. Who had seen the victims last? Who had spoken to them? Where had they been throughout the evening? Who had entered the house? Who had left? Every phone call, every receipt, every CCTV camera, every witness statement, it all mattered. Outside, however, another investigation had already begun. The internet. Within hours, photographs of the victims were everywhere. Maps of the house appeared online. Videos from previous evenings were shared millions of times. People who had never set foot in Moscow suddenly believed they could solve the case from hundreds or thousands of miles away. Names were posted. Photographs were analysed. Completely innocent people found themselves accused by strangers. Some of those accusations spread around the world before police had even completed their first full day at the crime scene. Investigators repeatedly appealed for patience. They urged the public not to jump to conclusions. They insisted they were following the evidence. But in a case this high profile, the evidence wasn't moving as quickly as public opinion. One question dominated every press conference. Was the community safe? Police initially believed the attack had been targeted. That statement was intended to reassure the public. Instead, it created even more questions. Targeted by who? Why? What made investigators believe that? As days passed, anxiety grew. Students returned home early. Some parents refused to let their children go back to university. Businesses closed earlier than usual. People who had never locked their doors before began checking them twice before going to bed. Behind the scenes, local detectives were no longer working alone. The Idaho State Police joined the investigation. Then came the FBI. Experienced behavioral analysts, digital forensic specialists, crime scene experts, cell phone analysts. Hundreds of investigators from multiple agencies began working together. Thousands of tips poured in from across the United States. Some were useful, many weren't. Each one still had to be assessed, ruled in or ruled out. Then, as crime scene specialists continued their meticulous examination of the house, investigators discovered something they believed did not belong there. A single item, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. At first glance, it may not have seemed significant, but before long, it would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, and it would eventually lead detectives to a name they had never heard before: Brian Kohberger. By now, investigators had processed thousands of pieces of information, witness statements, mobile phone records, hours upon hours of CCTV footage, vehicle sightings, forensic evidence collected from outside the house. Most of it led nowhere. That's the reality of major investigations. For every promising lead, there are hundreds that end in disappointment. But detectives knew something the public didn't. Among the evidence recovered from the crime scene was a tan leather knife sheath. It had been found on a bed near two of the victims. On its own, it wasn't enough to identify a killer. People leave objects behind for all sorts of innocent reasons. The challenge wasn't simply discovering the sheath. It was proving who had last handled it. Crime scene specialists examined it with extraordinary care. Eventually, they recovered a minute sample of DNA from the metal snap fastener. It wasn't much, but sometimes a microscopic trace is all investigators need. The sample was entered into the investigative process. At the same time, detectives continued another line of inquiry, the white Hyundai Elantra. For weeks, investigators have painstakingly reviewed security camera footage from homes, businesses and public buildings across Moscow and neighbouring Pullman. Camera by camera, street by street, hour by hour, they mapped the vehicle's movements. The footage suggested that the Elantra had travelled through the area several times during the early hours before the murders. Then shortly after the estimated time of the attack, it left at speed. Investigators publicly appealed for information about the vehicle. Almost immediately, thousands of tips flooded in. Most led nowhere, but one officer, working many miles away at Washington State University, noticed something. A white Hyundai Elantra registered to one of the university's students. The owner was a 28-year-old doctoral student studying criminology. His name, Brian Koberger. At that stage, owning a similar vehicle proved nothing. White Hyundai Elantras were not rare. Police couldn't arrest someone simply because they drove the same make and model of car. They needed much more. So the investigation quietly shifted. Detectives began looking into Koberger's background, his movements, his phone records, his vehicle, his daily routine. They didn't announce this publicly. In fact, while millions of people debated suspects online, Brian Koberger's name had still never been mentioned. The investigation had entered a new phase, not one driven by rumour, but by evidence. As detectives dug deeper, they began comparing multiple strands of information. The DNA, the vehicle, the digital evidence. Individually, none of those strands told the full story. Together, investigators believed they were beginning to point in the same direction. Then they uncovered something else. Phone records that investigators alleged painted a picture extending far beyond the night of the murders. If those records were accurate, this wasn't the first time that phone had been near King Road, and that discovery would raise an entirely new question. Was the house chosen at random, or had someone been watching it long before that November morning? By late November, investigators believed they were beginning to see a pattern. It hadn't appeared overnight, it hadn't come from dramatic confession, or a single eyewitness. It had emerged slowly, one piece of evidence at a time. The white Hyundai Elantra, the forensic evidence, the digital trail, the phone records, each strand investigators believed was beginning to point towards the same individual. For the first time, detectives had someone they wanted to know much more about. Brian Christopher Koberger, 28 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, a graduate student who had moved across the country to begin a PhD in criminology at Washington State University. On paper, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wasn't a celebrity, he wasn't known to police, he had no public profile. To many of the people who crossed paths with him, he was simply another postgraduate student beginning a new chapter of his life. But as investigators quietly examined his background, another detail emerged, one that would capture headlines around the world. Months before the murders, Koberger had taken part in an academic research project examining criminal decision-making. As part of that work, he posted an online questionnaire seeking responses from people who had committed crimes. The survey asked participants to describe what they had been thinking before committing an offence, how they selected their target, how they felt during the crime, and what emotions they experienced afterwards. At the time it was posted, it attracted little attention. To anyone reading it then, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be: a criminology research survey. Only after Kohberger became the focus of the investigation did those questions return to public attention. Millions of people would later read them again. Not because the survey proved anything, it didn't, nor did investigators suggest the questionnaire itself was evidence of criminal intent. But in the aftermath of the murders, many people found themselves looking back at those questions through an entirely different lens. It's important to separate hindsight from evidence. Universities around the world conduct research into criminal behaviour. Criminologists interview offenders, study decision-making, analyse violent crime. Understanding criminal behaviour is a legitimate field of academic study, and nothing about conducting that type of research, by itself, suggests wrongdoing. What made this survey so unsettling wasn't the questions themselves. It was what happened afterwards. As investigators continued building their case, they weren't relying on a Reddit questionnaire. They were relying on forensic science, digital evidence, vehicle movements, witness statements, and a growing body of information which, they believed, placed Brian Kohberger at the centre of their investigation. Away from the public eye, detectives were now watching carefully, monitoring his movements, comparing every new piece of evidence against the timeline they had spent weeks constructing. They knew the next step had to be right, because if they were wrong, the real killer could still be free. Meanwhile, Brian Kohberger carried on with his life. He attended university, travelled around Washington, and as the Thanksgiving holiday approached, prepared to make the long drive back to his family home in Pennsylvania. Investigators noticed that too, and they had no intention of letting him disappear. Not now. Not when they believed they were closer than ever before to solving one of America's most high-profile murder cases. The investigation was about to leave Idaho and cross the United States. By December 2022, the investigation had entered its most critical stage. Behind closed doors, detectives believed they were closing in, but believing and proving are two very different things. The DNA recovered from the knife sheath, the movements of the white Hyundai Elantra, the mobile phone data, the surveillance footage, each piece of evidence appeared to strengthen the investigation. But before an arrest could be made, detectives needed confidence that everything pointed in the same direction. They couldn't afford mistakes. Not in a case watched by millions. Not in a case involving 4 young lives. As Thanksgiving approached, Brian Kohberger left Washington State and began the long drive east to Pennsylvania. His father flew across the country to make the journey home with him. Together, they travelled thousands of miles. To anyone watching, it looked like a son returning home for the holidays. But they weren't travelling alone. Investigators were watching too. According to later reports, law enforcement monitored Kohberger's journey as he crossed the United States. Every stop, every overnight stay, every mile, carefully documented. By the time he arrived at his family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, the investigation had become a coordinated effort involving multiple agencies, including the FBI. Yet even then, detectives waited. Patience has always been one of the most valuable tools in a murder investigation. Move too early, and crucial evidence may never be found. Move too late, and a suspect may disappear. Investigators believed they had one final opportunity to strengthen their case. Outside the Kohberger family home, surveillance continued. Then came a seemingly ordinary moment. Rubbish. something every household throws away without a second thought. Investigators legally recovered discarded items that had been placed out for collection. Those items were examined for DNA. The purpose was to prove Brian Kohberger had handled the knife sheath. It was determined that the DNA recovered from the rubbish was consistent with coming from the biological father of the person who had left DNA on the sheath. When the results came back, investigators believed they had another crucial piece of the puzzle. Taken alongside everything else they had gathered, they were ready. In the early hours of 30th December 2022, darkness still covered Pennsylvania. Most of the neighbourhood was asleep. Police vehicles moved quietly into position. Armed officers surrounded the house. Inside, Brian Kohberger was asleep. Moments later, officers forced their way through the front door. The silence was shattered. Within minutes, the man investigators had spent weeks tracking was in custody. News of the arrest spread with astonishing speed. Across Idaho, across America, across the world. For the families of Kaylee, Maddie, Xana and Ethan, there was relief that someone had finally been arrested. But an arrest isn't a conviction. Police believed they had found the right man. Now they would have to prove it in court. As television cameras gathered outside the Pennsylvania home, another question quickly emerged. Who exactly was Brian Kohberger? Former classmates began speaking to journalists. Neighbours shared memories. People searched for clues that might explain how a doctoral criminology student had become the focus of one of the biggest murder investigations in recent memory. Some searched for warning signs, others insisted there had been none. But one thing was certain: the investigation wasn't over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. When Brian Kohberger was arrested in Pennsylvania, the world finally had a name. But a name wasn't enough. People had arrested a suspect. Now they had to convince a court and eventually a jury that they had arrested the right man. For weeks, investigators had remained remarkably tight-lipped. That changed when the probable cause affidavit was unsealed. For the first time, the public could begin to understand why detectives believed Brian Kohberger was responsible for the murders. It wasn't one dramatic breakthrough, it was the accumulation of evidence. Like thousands of tiny pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, the first piece, the knife sheath, recovered from the crime scene. Crime scene specialists had identified a minute sample of DNA on the metal strap. Investigators alleged that DNA was consistent with Brian Kohberger, but they didn't stop there. The investigation had never relied on a single piece of forensic evidence. Detectives also traced the movements of a white Hyundai Elantra through an extensive network of surveillance cameras. Camera after camera, street after street, the vehicle's journey was reconstructed with painstaking precision. Investigators alleged that the car travelled repeatedly through the King Road neighbourhood before the murders. Then shortly after the estimated time of the attack, it was seen leaving the area. Another strand of evidence came from mobile phone records. According to investigators, Brian Kohberger's phone appeared to travel towards Moscow during the early hours of 13th of November. They also alleged that before the murders, the phone had been detected in the vicinity of the King Road neighbourhood on multiple occasions. Exactly why has never been publicly established. Investigators argued it demonstrated a pattern. The defence would later challenge aspects of the prosecution's interpretation of the digital evidence. As with any criminal case, the role of a court is to weigh the evidence presented by both sides. Then there was the testimony of the surviving roommate. She described opening the bedroom door during the early hours of the morning after hearing unusual noises. Standing in the hallway, she saw a man dressed in black. His face was largely covered, but one feature stood out. bushy eyebrows. It wasn't an identification. She did not name Brian Kohberger, but investigators believed her account supported the timeline they had constructed from the forensic and digital evidence. As more court documents became public, people around the world began debating every detail. Could the phone evidence be explained another way? Was the vehicle identification reliable? How significant was the DNA? Every development became headline news. Legal experts analysed every file. Former detectives offered opinions. The internet once again exploded with theories. But while commentators argued online, something unexpected happened. The trial that millions expected to watch never truly arrived. In 2025, before opening statements could begin, Brian Kohberger chose to plead guilty to the murders of Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, as well as burglary. The plea meant there would be no full trial, no cross-examination of witnesses before a jury, no dramatic courtroom battle over every piece of evidence. For some families it meant avoiding years of appeals and uncertainty. For others, it meant losing the opportunity to hear the evidence tested publicly, and perhaps most importantly, to hear one question answered. Why? Even after admitting responsibility, Brian Kohberger offered no public explanation for his actions, no motive, no apology, no account of what had driven him to that house in the early hours of a cold November morning. The evidence had answered the question of who, but perhaps the most haunting question of all remained unanswered. For almost 3 years, the families of Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin have waited for answers, waited for justice, waited for the day they would finally stand in a courtroom and hear the man responsible held accountable. When Brian Kohberger pleaded guilty, that day arrived. He admitted responsibility for the murders. The guilty plea brought one question to an end: who was responsible? But it didn't answer every question. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom became a place not just of law, but of grief. One by one, family members stood before the court. Some spoke through tears, others through anger. Many spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, graduations that would never happen, Christmases with empty chairs around the table, lives that had been measured not by how they ended, but by how everything they should have become. Friends remembered laughter, parents remembered childhood, brothers and sisters remembered the ordinary moments that suddenly meant everything. Those statements served as a reminder that this case was never really about crime scene diagrams, or phone records, or forensic evidence. It was about 4 young people whose futures were stolen. The court sentenced Brian Kohberger to 4 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole, along with an additional sentence for burglary. It ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For many, that brought a sense of justice. For others, justice and closure were never the same thing. Because one question still hangs over this case. Why? Why this house? Why these victims? Was one person specifically targeted, or was the house itself the target? To this day there has been no public explanation from Brian Kohberger, no interview, no statement explaining his thinking, no attempt to answer the question that continues to haunt the families. Sometimes, criminal investigations answer every mystery. This wasn't one of them. The legal case may be over. The sentence has been passed, but the motive remains locked inside the mind of the only person who truly knows it. Today, 1122 King Road no longer stands. The house where 4 young lives were taken has since been demolished. For many, it had become a place of unimaginable pain, Its removal wasn't an attempt to erase history, it was an attempt to help a community begin to heal. But buildings can be demolished, memories can't. The names of Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Knodel, and even Chapin will forever be linked to one of the most significant criminal investigations of the 21st century. Yet that should never be all they are remembered for. They were daughters, a son, friends, classmates, people with careers ahead of them, people who made others laugh, people who were deeply loved. Long before they became victims, they were simply 4 young people living ordinary lives. And perhaps that's the greatest tragedy of all. Because on an ordinary Saturday night, they had every reason to believe they had a lifetime ahead of them. They never got the chance. Thank you for listening to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. If today's episode has stayed with you, I'd really appreciate it if you could follow the show, leave a rating or review, and share this episode with someone who enjoys true crime content. If you'd like to support the podcast and help me continue producing independent documentaries like this one, you'll find my Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also follow the podcast on social media for updates on future episodes. And if there's a case you'd like me to investigate, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden in plain sight.